Today, we're diving deep into one of the most beautiful and, frankly, genius processes in all of nature, how flowering plants make more of themselves. We're talking about angiosperms, the plants you see pretty much everywhere. So let's get into it. We all love flowers. We admire them for their colors, their beauty, their smell. But what if I told you there's so much more than that? To a biologist, they are these incredible tiny machines, just perfectly engineered for one single purpose, creating the next generation. They're not just pretty faces, they are true biological marvels. So what's their secret sauce? What is it about flowering plants that allowed them to totally dominate the planet? Well, it turns out they have a few key innovations, some major evolutionary advantages that set them apart from everybody else in the plant kingdom. Okay, so what are these advantages? Well, first up, the most obvious one, the flowers themselves. These are highly specialized structures built for one thing, reproduction. Second, they make fruits. A fruit is basically just a clever, protective packaging for the seeds, designed to help them get out into the world. And third, and this is a really cool one, they have a process called double fertilization. It's this super efficient system that we're definitely going to get into a little later. To really get a grip on how this all works, we first need to pop the hood and look at the architecture of a flower. Think of it like a blueprint, where every single part has a very specific and crucial job to do. So a typical flower is built in 4 layers, or whorls. Starting from the very outside, you have the calyx. That's made of sepals, those little green leafy bits that protect the flower when it's still a bud. Moving one layer in, you get to the flashy part, the corolla. This is made of petals, and their job is to be bright and beautiful to attract pollinators. And then, right at the very center, you find the business end of the flower, the male parts, called the androecium, and the female parts, the gynecium. Let's zoom in on these key players. The male part, the androecium, is made up of units called stamens. Each stamen has a stalk, the filament, and on top of that sits the anther. The anther is the pollen factory. That's where the male gametes are made. Now, over on the female side, the gynecium is made of 1 or more pistils. A pistil has 3 parts. The stigma at the top, which is sticky to catch pollen, the style, a tube that connects the top to the bottom, and the ovary at the base, which holds and protects the all-important ovules. All right, so we know the parts, but how do they actually work? Let's start with the male side of the story. We're going to follow the incredible journey of a single pollen grain, that tiny, powerful little vessel that carries the male genetic code. So, if you look closely at an anther, it usually has 2 lobes, but it's even more intricate than that. Each of those lobes is actually split into 2 chambers. This means you end up with a grand total of 4 little compartments, which we call pollen sacs. These sacs are protected by 4 layers of tissue, and that innermost layer, the tapetum, is absolutely critical. It's like the kitchen and the nursery all rolled into one, providing all the food for the developing pollen. Inside each of those pollen sacs, a process called microsporogenesis kicks off. It all starts with a single microspore mother cell. This is a diploid cell, meaning it has a full set of chromosomes. This mother cell then goes through meiosis. That's the special cell division that cuts the chromosome number in half. The result? A little cluster of 4 haploid cells called a microspore tetrad. Finally, this cluster breaks apart, and you're left with 4 individual microspores, ready for the next step. Now, before we see what happens to those microspores, we have to talk about their armor. The outer wall of a pollen grain is coated in one of the toughest organic materials known to science, sporopollenin. This stuff is practically indestructible. You can hit it with high temperatures, strong acids, powerful enzymes, and it just survives. It's the reason we can find fossilized pollen from millions of years ago. How wild is that? It's biological body armor at its absolute best. So now that it's got its supersuit on, that tiny microspore begins to mature. It develops into what's called the male gametophyte, and that's just a fancy name for the final, fully developed pollen grain, carrying the male gametes and ready for its mission to find an egg. This whole maturation process happens in a couple of steps. First, the microspore divides once, creating 2 new cells inside the pollen grain, a big one called the vegetative cell and a smaller one called the generative cell. Now, for over 60% of all flowering plants, this is it. The pollen is shed at this 2-celled stage. But for the others, there's one more division. That smaller generative cell divides again to form the 2 male gametes. That gives you a fully mature 3-celled pollen grain armed and ready to go. All right, that was the male story. Pretty incredible stuff. But it's only half the picture.
Let's switch gears and head over to the female parts to see the equally amazing process of getting the egg cell ready inside what's called the embryo sac.
So deep inside the ovule, a very similar process called megasporogenesis begins. Just like on the male side, you start with a single diploid mother cell. It goes through meiosis and it produces 4 haploid cells. But here is the massive twist. Instead of all 4 surviving, 3 of them just degenerate. They die off. Only one functional megaspore is chosen to survive. Nature decides to put all its eggs, or, well, all its resources, into one basket.
And this whole strategy of focusing all the nutrients and energy into one single survivor actually has a name. It's called monosporic development. The fact that it's the most common way plants do this tells you it's a very, very successful strategy. Quality over quantity. So what happens to our lone survivor? This is where things get really weird and wonderful. Its nucleus divides, and divides, and divides again, 3 times in a row. But get this, no cell walls are formed yet. It's what we call free nuclear division. So you end up with 8 nuclei just floating around inside one big supercell. It's only after all 8 are formed that the cell says, okay, time to build the rooms, and cell walls finally appear. And this bizarre construction method leads to a structure that is famous in botany. The final mature embryo sac is described as being 7-celled and 8-nucleate. Now, hold on. How does that math work? 7 cells, but 8 nuclei. That doesn't seem to add up. Or does it? Well, here's how it works. At one end of the sac, you have 3 cells called antipodals. At the other end, where the action happens, you've got the most important group, the egg cell, protected by its 2 little helper cells, the synergids. Okay, that's 6 cells so far. The magic is right in the middle. You have one giant central cell, and it contains the last 2 nuclei. So there you have it, 7 total cells, but because that big one in the middle has 2 nuclei, you get a grand total of 8 nuclei. Puzzle solved. Okay, let's take a deep breath. We've seen all this mind-bogglingly complex preparation on both the male and female sides. All of this microscopic engineering is leading up to one single moment, fertilization. So what happens after that? What happens once life's blueprint is delivered? Well, this is the moment the entire flower has been working towards. A truly spectacular transformation kicks off. The ovule, the part that houses that precious egg cell, begins to develop into a seed with a tiny plant embryo tucked inside. And the ovary, the structure that was protecting the ovule this whole time, swells and ripens and becomes the fruit. The beautiful flower petals wither away. Their job is done, leaving behind the next generation. And that brings us right back to where we started. When you understand everything that goes into it, from the anatomy to the microscopic dance of cell division, you realize the flower is, without a doubt, an embryological marvel. It is a perfect, sophisticated, self-contained system designed for one single glorious purpose, the continuation of life. So that leaves us with a final thought. We've just unpacked the insane level of detail and complexity that goes into making a single seed, a process happening in millions of flowers all around us right now. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If this much wonder is hidden inside something we see every day, what other profound, intricate marvels of nature are we walking past